Anna Pollack just told us why the story of Daniel Christian Wahl is important, but I should also tell you that he is an international consultant and educator specializing in biologically inspired whole systems design and transformative innovation. In his exciting keynote, Daniel will share his vision for a healthier tourism, his deep understanding of natural systems and ways in which humans can work with them to generate thriving communities as well as robust, better performing economies. Ladies and gentlemen, Christian Wahl.
Good morning. I feel really grateful for this opportunity. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everybody for coming. This is a really important topic. How are we going to travel to tomorrow? And Anna said I'm going to start with the big picture, so I'm really going to start with the big picture here, because sometimes it helps to remember that we're all living in one planet, and that this planet is traveling at 107,000 kilometers an hour around our sun. And our sun is spiraling within the Milky Way, which you can see, this is the Milky Way, at the speed of 828,000 kilometers an hour. So we're travelers, and we're traveling fast. But also to get, I'm starting with this slide to get, because travel to tomorrow is about tourism's role in place. And that idea of place is fractal in dimension, which means it starts in your local community, it starts in this church, it starts in Bruges, it starts in the region of Flanders, but it also is the place that we inhabit, which is this wonderful living planet. And the uniqueness of this place really we would do well to reflect on, because just in our galaxy, our Milky Way galaxy, there are 200 billion stars. Each one of them might have multiple planetary systems around it. And there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And somehow, in this one tiny little blue dot in space that we're zooming around the universe in, the conditions have been such that life could evolve over 3.8 billion years. And Mars is just in the right position to shelter us from meteorites hitting us and to bend the solar winds in a way that life can evolve on this planet. And here, this little blue line is the atmosphere that has actually been formed by life over billions of years, so life forms like ours could evolve. So really, we're all passengers on living Spaceship Earth. And what each and every one does, all of you, me, every day, does or doesn't do, affects everything. A friend of mine, professor for systems science at the University of Hull, says everything is an intervention. We're constantly changing the future. And how we travel to tomorrow will affect where we will arrive. And this man saw this many years ago. He wrote a book in 1969, its 50th anniversary this year, called An Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth. And when he speaks about, and the survival of humanity depends on the integrity of the individual, that means we all have to really understand our own importance and agency in this and act with integrity. And acting with integrity is about ethics. And there's another wonderful quote by a pioneer of conservation, Aldo Leopold, who said, "A thing is right if it protects the vitality and the integrity of the biotic community. It is wrong if it does otherwise." If we keep that sentence in mind as we work on tourism and design tourism initiatives, we're already stepping into a new way of thinking. So coming home to where I live on this little island, and you can see the planet at night from the International Space Station. We've created conditions to life, lighting up the night sky for one form of life, us. But we've neglected that we deeply depend on all other forms of life as well. And we've pumped CO2 and greenhouse gases into this atmosphere, and we're beginning to see the consequences of that. So, homing in on the place that I live and bringing it closer to tourism, the place I live is the place where all-inclusive mass tourism was invented, the island of Majorca. In 2018, 2 new documentaries came out that talk about the phenomenon of over-tourism. We have 13.8 million international tourists visit the island every year, 5.2 million Spanish tourists to add to that. Palma Airport in the summer is one of the busiest airports in Europe, with 29 million passengers coming through it. And this regional economy is directly dependent, like about 30% of the people work directly in tourism, and 44% of the regional GDP is from tourism. But if you look at all the supplying industries, it's really 85% of the economy is addicted to tourism. And of course, over-tourism has left the population seeing numbers grow, seeing income from tourism grow, but inequality has grown as well. And people haven't actually been sharing in the riches that this tourism enterprise has generated. So there's a big backlash. And maybe regions like Flanders, where I think tourism is about 5% of the GDP being a completely inadequate measure of success anyway, but I won't go into that. It's slightly different. I'm going to talk from my experience about a place where over-tourism is already happening. But as Anna said, my profession isn't really directly related to tourism. As a scientist, I've worked for a number of years looking at existential threats to humanity. And on Majorca, it happens so that we have the international pre-warning stations to monitor the night skies and avoid collisions with asteroids, if we could ever avoid them, to pre-warn us that we might have an asteroid coming in. Because that is one of the existential threats to humanity, and there's relatively little we can do about it. But the one that I want to talk in more detail about is climate change and the collapse of ecosystems, because it is something that we're now beginning to see everywhere on the planet, and any of you who read the news should be aware of this by now. So, Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old girl from Sweden, who happens to be blessed with a condition called Asperger's, which means that she doesn't care about what the context of an issue is and whether some people say you can't change the economy, it just runs as it does. She just looks at what she's being told and says, wait a minute, don't you listen to the scientists? If we don't change rapidly within the next 3 to 11 years, we might lose our opportunity to change and respond to this existential threat to humanity. And this graph over here is actually from a presentation by Professor John Bebbington, who in 2009 was the chief scientist of the UK, and I was working with him and others on a project that was published by UK Foresight called the International Dimension of Climate Change Impact. And what we were looking at, we divided the world into 17 regions, looked at the IPCC data, and looked at how climate change by 2030 and 2050 would potentially impact these regions, and what impact that would then have on the UK. Not a clear science, very complex. But what I want to draw your attention to is this slide, which was already shocking in 2009, but now that 2030 is a lot closer, where we see that the increasing demand for food, water, and energy all affect each other. You need water to run power stations. But also, they're all affected by climate change, and they all affect climate change. And so this creates a wicked problem cluster where everything feeds onto itself. And so in only 10, 11 years' time, we will hit what John Bedding called a perfect storm already 10 years ago. And now is the time to respond to that. So I'm going to get off climate change in a minute, just very briefly to really hammer it home. These are the fires in Brazil. This is methane bubbling up in lakes in Canada as the permafrost is melting. This is Greenland without snow cover this summer, burning, because as the methane comes up from the ground, turf and forests start burning. The Arctic is on fire. The Amazon is on fire. These are images of Siberia where giant methane bubbles are coming out of the ground. Methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. This is also an image from this summer where the sea ice around Greenland is melting to the point that these sledge dogs are walking in melting water on the ice underneath. And this image is just talking about the fact that for millions of years, and particularly the last 250 years since we've been spewing out lots of greenhouse gases, the oceans have been the giant buffer. They have absorbed the CO2, but this has caused a process of ocean acidification. And once that gets to a certain point, then instead of absorbing CO2, the oceans start releasing CO2. And combining all these trigger points together means that we're very close to a point where we will not be able to reverse cataclysmic climate change and the end of life on Earth as we know it. We have a window of opportunity that, depending on who you listen to, this is the International Panel on Climate Change, last year said we have 12 years left. 12 years feels like not alarming enough. The UN Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, said 3 years at maximum, and he said that last year. So, again, this has been a process that has gone on for a long time. Humanity went into planetary overshoot in the 1970s, in early 1970, when I was born. And since then, because we've kept destroying the ecosystems and degrading the environment, the average number of hectares per person, and of course our numbers have been growing rapidly as well, has been going down ever since. And so every year, we, as a species, by July 29th, 2019, we already used up all the resources provided by life on this planet that we, if we wanted to be wise, should have made last all the year. So from July 2019, we're digging into the capital rather than living off the interest. And Belgium already got to that point on April 6th, and Spain, where I live, on May 28th. And you can see that so many of the industrialized nations, but also the industrializing nations, are already in overshoot. And obviously, this can't continue. The Stockholm Resilience Center has created this framework of planetary boundaries, 9 boundaries that we need to stay within in order to create a safe operating space for humanity. And we've already surpassed 4 of them. And 2 of them we haven't even looked at in detail yet, and we don't know whether we've surpassed them. And then in 2012, Kate Raworth, while she was working for Oxfam, for the UN summit in Rio, the Rio Plus 20 summit, created this idea that it's not just about planetary boundaries. In order to stay within planetary boundaries, we need to create the socioeconomic foundations for people in place to be able to thrive. So she came up with this idea of donut economics. The donut really just meaning that you have the ecological ceiling and the social foundations, and this kind of ring is the sweet spot. And to give it a name, she called it a donut. So tourism is one of the industries that has caused this impact, humanity's impact on the globe. It follows the classic exponential curve. And I know this is a contentious subject. People really like growth because that's what we've been taught. But any life form, as Anna briefly mentioned, has this initial exponential growth, and then it starts to level out. You stopped growing at some point in terms of size and started to grow in quality. You learned, you became wiser. That's what we now have to do as a species. We have to learn how to make that curve. And if we don't, then life will find ways to teach us otherwise. So what is this concept of regeneration? And very briefly, kind of oversimplifying it, you could say we have conventional practice, which is basically business as usual, staying within legal limits. Green says we do a few things, make things a little greener, and congratulate ourselves for it, which is a step. Sustainable in this context is really saying we're not adding any more damage to the system. But because, as I've shown, we have added so much damage to the system, that's no longer enough. We need to start to restore and regenerate the systems, the communities, and the ecosystems we live in. Again, for you in the back, you won't even be able to read this. Anna said it already, these slides will be made available, so don't get stuck on the slides. You can read them afterwards. But this particular resource, which I highly recommend you look up on the internet, is a paper that Fritjof Capra and Hazel Henderson wrote about the concept of qualitative growth, about how we can actually also as economies grow the number of healthy ecosystems, grow the quality of our soils, grow the social cohesion of our communities, and create a kind of growth that is actually positive and get away from, like this lists a whole number of opportunities where tourism can get involved in doing this shift. And this lists some of the reasons why tourism as usual is not an option anymore. In many ways, tourism, because it is one of those industries that touches everything by providing the opportunity to live a daily, normal life rhythm in a place where we don't live when we go there and visit it. You touch housing, you touch transport, energy, water, all sorts of consumer products. And tourism industries therefore have a massive opportunity to influence the local economy and become agents of re-energizing the re-regionalization and relocalization of production and consumption, of creating new opportunities for innovation in a region, of diversifying the local economy, and actually becoming stakeholders in local renewable energy production. Why not risk manage your tourism empire by investing in a local renewable energies cooperative and helping to use some of the money that comes in from tourism to build renewables capacity? And you can do the same with organic farming, you can do the same with the local production of detergents, cleaning products, all those kind of things that a tourism business needs to operate. So we are in this process of this framework. Again, if you're in the business of having to manage transformation and change, this little booklet by a colleague of mine from the International Futures Forum called 3 Horizons, A Patterning of Hope, is very informative. And it basically speaks about how we go from a business as usual that is no longer fit for purpose, while considering what is useful of this business and we do want in the tomorrow we arrive at, and create this new viable future using, rather than a collapse and rebuild scenario, a bridge, which is this important tourism in transition. And I think that Visit Flanders is really pioneering in asking these deeper questions, not about how do we tweak tourism a little bit and make it more effective or more efficient, but how do we transform tourism in a way that it actually becomes an agent and catalyst of positive change in place and in region. And there are three types of changes that you could say happen on 4 different levels of scale: individual, working group, the affected community, and the wider culture we operate in. And the kind of change we now need is transformative change, which is really a completely, it's the change from the caterpillar to the butterfly. And so much of our innovation these days, when we talk about transformation, is unfortunately, as a colleague of mine, Nora Bateson, has wonderfully put it, about creating caterpillars with wings rather than butterflies. And that's the kind of adaptive change that just uses the building blocks we already have, the elements we already have, and makes them function differently, rather than fundamentally transforming the business from within. And also, the kind of just adjustment, which is what managers tend to do, is just we change a few building blocks and move them around. But both of these, adaptation and adjustment, might be needed in the transition, but we have to be very careful to keep the larger horizon of actually saying, can tourism become a way that we build climate resilience in our place and in our region? That we prepare for a very difficult 3 decades that we don't know whether we're going to make it through that eye of the needle. But tourism could have a role in preparing us for it. And tourism could also have, to some extent, one of the negative impacts globally. Tourism has been the thin end of the wedge of neoliberal economic globalization. It has come in to communities that were illiterate and didn't have electricity and built fancy tourism resorts there. And now the opportunity would be to basically redeem, maybe being in a church, we can use that kind of language. Tourism has an opportunity to redeem itself for its past sins and actually become an agent of positive change. And I think this conference and the Travel to Tomorrow project is the beginning of that conversation. And I'm deeply grateful to Peter for having started that conversation, living in a place where my future and my daughter's future deeply depend on working with tourism, because 85% of the Majorcan economy is dependent on it. So basically, in 20 years of working on the question, how can we redesign the human presence and impact on Earth in a way that life and humanity has a future, I spent a long time working at the scale of local communities. And I deeply believe that the only way to create global change is to work with your local neighborhood and your little community. I lived in an eco-village that was experimenting with all these ideas. And I still believe that local communities are where action happens and transformation happens. But really, in terms of whole systems design, it is the regions, the scale of bioregions, you can call it, or in economic terms, it's the mesoeconomics. It's not the microeconomics of communities and businesses. It's not the macroeconomics of nations and the planet, but it is the local regional economies that we can influence critically. And these resilience building and adaptation pathways that involve restoring the health of our local ecosystems, restoring the soil, managing the water in wise ways, and creating regionally focused biomaterials economies that are circular, using renewable energy. All of this is what we need to do to redesign our impact on Earth. And whether you're with the alarmists who say it's already too late and climate change will get the best and worst of us, or you go with the people who say we still have a chance, but we need to act now. The pathway to making it through the eye of the needle, or the pathway to preparing for the horrors of climate change that are coming, is the same. It is bringing our capacity to meet human needs at the local and regional level closer to home again. And tourism can play a role in that. This report came out 2 days ago. It's from the Global Center for Adaptation to Climate Change and Climate Resilience. And what I like about it is, well, there's a lot that I like about it, and some of the language is still locked within the growth paradigm. But it shows in this little graphic how caring for the region and the ecosystem of the region has multiple benefits that builds climate resilience. And so taking this regional approach, so to look from the mountains to the sea, working on both water management, soil management, and the way that cities draw resources from the region, is inviting a regional approach to build climate resilience. Okay, some of you have seen this tree before. It's the lime tree that is the image central to Visit Flanders. And again, all of this detail, you in the back won't even be able to read it. This spells out in more detail what this regenerative approach can do for tourism and how the two are connected. And I'm, okay, just looking at my time here. So I won't go into this in detail. I also, because I have so much to share and so little time to share it in, I've started a series of blogs on my blog in Medium. I've already published 2 of them. There'll be another 2, and you'll get the links for that. So all this, the detail that I can't share with you will be on either the slide decks or in these blogs. Just briefly to make it real and give you some examples, what have I done to practice what I'm preaching in this church? Here, these are some projects that I've been involved in Majorca in the last 8 years. We've created a website and a little guide that has reanimated ancient pilgrimage routes to a monastery or a sanctuary up in the mountains of Majorca. This one was already in existence. It was one of those GR long-distance hiking tracks, the GR 221. But the other ones had kind of been forgotten. And so we created a map and a story behind them and invited people to make that shift that one of my mentors so beautifully put it. What we as humanity have to do is we have to stop being tourists and we have to start being pilgrims on Earth. Tourists can ask from a place, what can this place give to me? A pilgrim comes with respect, comes with the wanting to learn, with wanting to share, with wanting to tread lightly in the place he or she travels. I've also worked, I mentioned detergents earlier. I worked with a Belgian company, Ecovert, and Forum for the Future, and a satellite startup company in Oxford to look into using Majorca as a test field for this idea of regional biomaterial circular economies. And we investigated whether we could use municipal waste streams and forestry waste streams to create the chemicals that would then be needed to make soaps and floor cleaning products and detergents for laundry and so on, so we could wash the linen of 500,000 tourist beds on Majorca. And in the process, we learned a lot and connected lots of local industries together. I've also worked with a tourism cluster in innovation in tourism and gave them a whole list of where tourism could help the transition towards a sustainable Majorca or regenerative island Majorca. I helped to create 3 documentaries on, like this one, basically tells different stories of resilience initiatives and change initiatives on the island. And the more recent one focuses on the issue of marine plastics and phasing out single-use plastics. I've given talks on circular economy, helped to start the 4th sector network, which is a network that uses the techniques and agility of the private sector to address the issues that the public sector should be addressing but isn't addressing, but uses the values of the civil society sector and brings all of that together. And it's an emerging field. A lot of people, when you ask them which sector do you work in, can't quite place themselves, and that means they're probably working in this fourth sector area. I've also, as an educator, designed a set of flashcards that help local communities have conversations around how to implement the SDGs in place. And they've been taken up by UNESCO and translated into 7 languages by now. And we ran workshops, and are still running workshops on Majorca to engage local communities and the tourism industry in how to implement the SDGs. So yeah, we're really traveling at high speed towards a tomorrow that, if you look at the science, it looks pretty alarming. We do have an opportunity to turn this around. It's not too late, but we really need to act now. And tourism, because it has this amazing fractal dimension, just like place has a fractal dimension, it touches everything. It is a global local industry. And it touches all the sectors. So the opportunity when we shift into asking, what can tourism give back to the world, is vast. And when Anna Pollock shared with me a paper that she wrote in 1995, where she identified that tourism can be a healing business and a business of renewal and a force for transformation, I thought, what an honor to be working with an elder who had the foresight so many years ago. So I'm really pleased to have been invited here. And just at the end, I'm giving you some initiatives, very specific, like this is on Majorca, somebody running opportunities for tourists to come and make local honey, or to help people rebuild the stone walls of Majorca, to really engage tourists with typically specific Majorcan resilience building activities. This organization has been around for a long time, giving people an opportunity to really engage with people in place in a completely different way, much more travel as a pilgrim rather than a tourist. The whole idea of regenerative tourism has already taken off in Central and South America. It's just something very new still in the conversation in Europe. And this little initiative is looking at how will we travel in the future? Will we go back to marine transport? Will we use solar and wind power again to move us from A to B? And we just, the absolute take-home message for what I would like to share with you is to stop thinking about what we have to do to change tourism a little bit, and start thinking about what can I do as a tourism professional to make tourism the agents of transformation, the catalyst of transformation, so my children and my children's children can have a future. And I think it's perfectly placed to be that agent. It's turning a problem into a solution. And that's what we have to do as humanity if we want to have a chance for a better tomorrow. So thank you very much. I see I have another minute and 20 seconds, and I actually did have another slide, very briefly. This is an initiative that I'm working on to give you a forward-looking opportunity. We're currently putting together a wonderful team of people. Kate Rayworth and Janine Benyus have already started work with cities all around the world within the C40s network to create a methodology to engage people in place at the city level to explore what thriving would look like. And the power of questions of what does it mean for people to thrive in this place? What does it mean for this place to thrive? How do we respect the rights of all people, and how do we respect the health of the whole planet? These are the 4 questions that guide a process that will help people do this regional transformation. And my hope is that we're piloting the evolution of this methodology on Majorca, which will mean that tourism will be central to the conversation, and there'll be a lot of learning from it. So stay tuned. This is hopefully going to happen. I don't know yet. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wahl. I hope you have time to answer
Absolutely.
some possible questions.
Gladly.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can ask some questions now, so feel free to ask. Please raise your hand and a microphone will be in front of you in just a few seconds. There's already a lady over there. And there's somebody over here.
Can you put up your hand again? So, yeah.
Coming with a microphone.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for your inspiring conversation here. I'm very interesting. We're working actually in a region in the Netherlands where there's a market to open. There's a lot of focus on Amsterdam, but the region of Gelderland, for example, is now looking for a direction. And we noticed that the first start is actually again to introduce a traditional tourism approach focused on growth. So how would you seduce all these policy people there to say, but it's not busy yet in our region, why should we start with a different direction now?
It's a very interesting question because basically, I don't know, sometimes it helps to create analogies. So for example, the Chinese realized that there was no way that they could potentially build up a car industry that would make cars as good as German or French cars quick enough. So what they decided is let's leapfrog internal combustion engines completely and experiment, make mistakes, start with the electric car now. And there are 50,000 electric taxis in Shenzhen alone. So giving them that kind of idea of saying, if we're slow in developing as a tourist destination, what we shouldn't do is to try to run behind the others and do what they've done. We have a huge opportunity to reinvent what tourism could look like in this place and become a model for a new way of working. But it's just, yeah, it's uphill battle. Anybody else? I'm also always really happy for critical reflections. So don't feel like if anything I said really didn't sit with you at all, please tell me. Yeah.
Okay, the microphone is coming.
Brilliant presentation, thank you. I think I'm interested in link to the previous question actually. At the policy level, often I'm a consultant, you go to work in a new destination and they look at the World Economic Forum indicators of what makes a destination good and then they try to meet those indicators. How do you go about changing those sorts of frameworks that drive national governments, they drive aid agencies, to reflect regenerative tourism? Where do you start to actually put those frameworks into a regenerative context?
What I would do is, what we've done as humanity to give us a lot of detailed knowledge about a lot of things is separate all the disciplines and become expert in narrower and narrower fields. And in a way, that education system has predisposed us to a blind spot of not understanding the whole system and how it interacts. And that's what has separated us from nature, and it meant that we used mechanistic metaphors instead of living systems metaphors and so on. So to come to your question, what I would do is I would look at other frameworks that policymakers have committed to and are publicly committing to. So the SDGs, you can have a nuanced opinion about how good they are and whether the targets underneath are the right targets and so on. But there's 17 goals, of which I would only question one, which is goal number 8, continued economic growth and good work. Like if they just put in the word qualitative growth and good work, I'd be happy with it. But if they keep it like it is the spanner in the works that will make all the other 16 not implementable, because our current economic growth addiction is what's driving the destruction of the planet. But starting with the SDGs and speaking to policy regulators and saying, well, how does your commitment to implementing the SDGs at a global forum square with your policy regulations of tourism? Where could you make policies that would enable the tourist industry to actually implement the SDGs at the local and regional scale? And if you look into the detail, energy production, water care, food procurement, local procurement of food, and connect all the other policies that they're talking about to tourism, then I think you have a beginning of a leverage point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's one in red.
There's another
about
question.
half the way
lady
down.
in red, yeah.
Come. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. My question was a little bit related to what Mr. Van den Driessen also said, that one of the cornerstones to have this qualitative growth, maybe no growth maybe, is the attitude of the tourists. Now we are a little bit in a contradiction there, that we see that a lot of people want to be sustainable and act sustainable unless they are on holidays. And it has to do with tourism. So where do you start? What is your suggestion on that issue?
Well, I'm not so sure, because I took the slide out in order to make the presentation shorter, but some of you might know that Prince Harry was involved in launching this Travelist initiative just last week, I think. And when I followed the media on that, I saw a bunch of statistics that they've offered in terms of large questionnaires that went around and asked tourists. And all the indication was that somewhere between 60 and 70% of tourists, given the choice, would prefer to travel in a way that does impact the environment less, and they're actually interested in tourism, the money that they leave in a destination, benefiting the destination, and that these large tourism empires don't become the middlemen and siphon off the wealth of tourism in a way that it doesn't actually hit the local community. So I'm not sure, like, of course, that it is a paradox that we all, I mean, I came here by airplane, and tourism as a whole, travel and tourism, contributes about 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions that humanity is emitting to exacerbate the climate change problem. So we definitely need to change the way we travel, but I think the willingness of the consumer is actually starting to change quite drastically, and initiatives like this Fridays for Future school strike is going to make the parents of these children even more aware that there now is a really urgent issue around avoiding cataclysmic runaway climate change. And I think it's really important to prepare for the changes that we will have demanded from us as an industry, from the consumer now. It's too late to wait. If in 5 years' time government policies starting to regulate the fact that kerosene is still not taxed, the minute we internalize the externalities, the costs, socially and ecological costs of tourism and travel, the economics of tourism will change drastically. And I think that's where what we need to prepare for now. And so certainly on a destination like Majorca, where I live, it's impossible that we'll have 18 million tourists arrive in 10 years' time. I don't think we will. And so we need to, even in that industry, shift towards a qualitative offer that has less tourists, that might stay for longer, that engage in a different way. Tourism has the opportunity to become part of reinventing education. Imagine that. That's a transformative idea, where tourism isn't just about consuming a nice experience, but sharing your expertise and taking learning in one place back to your home place. Tourism has a role in reinventing geriatric care and how we deal with elderly. Like all these infrastructures that might soon not be needed in those numbers could convert themselves into being places where people who are elderly can spend 3 or 4 months in a sheltered living type environment in the European South while the North is too cold. So we really need to think out of the box, I think, to do that.
Okay.
There's
Another question here.
Yeah.
Over there.
Yes, working.
In the ideal world, we all would be transformative and we all would reach a destination management scheme which allows us to be regenerative in the existing tourism destinations. However, tourism demand is growing faster and still faster and still faster. What are we going to do about that? Will new destinations emerge? They will probably do the same and be transformative, but nevertheless they will have, people moving around with no technology to adapt. What is the core problem then? It's the tourism demand. We are looking for a solution in the place, which is of course very necessary, but it doesn't catch the basic problem. And the basic problem could be A, too many people trying to move too much around this globe, and B, not being able to do it in a sustainable way. We never raised that question. Should we, as a sector, push further and, lobby towards new technology? Could it be solved with technology? Would we really need to be more tourists more and more times a year? Or do we have to say, I might do better without being no tourist this year? How would we manage that as destination marketeers? How do we dare to ask that question? Mm-hmm. Just an open idea.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I guess the way we measure success and the way we talk about the future is always a little bit of a double-edged sword. I mentioned that GDP is a very inadequate measure of success. There are a lot of conversations that we need to change our economic measure of success to include all the externalities, because at current rates, natural disasters are positive for GDP growth and so on. Similarly, I think all those predictions of tourism demand, it's rapid at the moment, but because tourism doesn't live in that bubble, it is part of the global system, which increasingly is coming closer together because of all the walls we're running into now. I think that those predictions might not pan out the way that we now believe. And so preparing, as I just said, for a contraction in numbers from international tourists, but maybe an expansion of numbers from more regional tourists is wise. Looking at enabling different ways of traveling that have less environmental impact is wise. There's a whole range of initiatives on nautical engineering and new types of sailboats. But again, it would also mean that this whole culture, shifting the culture from the kind of 2 or 3 day holiday break, fly somewhere on Ryanair, to a culture that might just mean going on holiday once a year for a longer period of time, and in a much deeper way, learning more deeply in the place. Maybe even work is changing as well. So people could, in a more flexible way, stay in the destination longer, but work from the destination, and creating the tourism infrastructures that would enable that would play into that. So, yeah.
people in Europe, so it might apply to us in the ideal world, but we have Chinese running around, we have Indians running around, they're catching up very fast on an economic scale, so they have money to spend. Can we say, no, you can't come? Can you, as an old continent, say towards the newcomers, no, you can't do the same error that we did? Maybe they want to do that. And who are we to say, maybe you should find a new way to travel to the new customers? Because we only look to the European and the North American people, but you never get into the mind of the other tourists of tomorrow. How are we going to cope that? Is it ethically acceptable to change their behavior or asking them to change their future behavior? I don't know. I think we should more ask such questions on the long term.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese government is promoting an initiative that is asking the question, what would an ecological civilization look like, and what role can China have in leading the world in creating such an ecological civilization? It might just be a big marketing trick, and a lot of the trends aren't such, but the awareness is growing everywhere. And again, it's this, sometimes it's very hard to imagine how quickly paradigms do shift when they finally shift. And so since China and India are in the front line of climate change, they will feel climate change hitting them hard much sooner. And it is an unfair fact of history that we, the northern nations, Europe, Belgium and the Congo and so on, there was the first large wave of colonialization, then was a second wave of neoliberal economics doing a new extraction and abuse of the global south. And now on top of it, the nations that are responsible for most of the emissions of greenhouse gases are the ones that are less affected than the ones that have already been hit twice by us. And to address that global issue and that inequality issue is massive. It goes much beyond tourism, and we need to address it. But again, bringing it back to that little girl with Asperger's, like when it becomes, one of the things that condition does is it creates a single focus and kind of blocks out the fuzz around it. And the issue of having to respond to this planetary emergency is now such that we don't have an option not to respond and to say, but the economists won't go along with it, or governments won't. They will. They'll have to, or else we'll suffer the consequences greatly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wahl. I have one more personal question for you. How does your ideal vacation look like?
Oh, now that's an interesting question. Lots of time to reconnect to what I would call the big power socket, which is spending time in nature, wild nature, as much as possible, pruning back to basics. So I love hiking holidays, camping holidays, in a place where I also feel that if I have to travel far to go there, that what I do there is giving back to the local community. Okay. So it's engaging with the local community. I have people talk a lot about work-life balance. I think that's a misconception. You're already setting yourself up for burnout because it somehow feels like when you're at work, you're not living. And so for me, I'm in the blissful situation that I don't really know where my work starts and where my life ends. Okay. And I would do the same thing with tourism. I would actually go to places only if I can also set up an opportunity to contribute to the place by giving talks or workshops or engaging local people.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wahl.
Thank you so much.